Hello, welcome back. We are moving on to Unit 2, First Encounters. I don't want to call it the discovery of America because, as we know, the land that is now called America, the United States, was here for a long time and populated with many people before the conquistadors, explorers, missionaries, etc. First encountered them. So that's what we're going to call First Encounters. A little note about the art up in the corner. It is complicated to find art representing this point in history because you can probably guess, just looking at it, that this was not a piece of art created by native peoples to represent the first encounters between them and the conquistadors. For one thing, everything looks really polite and nice. And once you start reading about what the actual interactions were like in Cabeza de Vaca's relation or narrative about his time, 8 years, basically being lost, living among the native peoples, and how he got there in the first place, and all the changes that he went through while he was here. When we look at that, when we look at the two different accounts of the Pueblo revolt, from the side of those revolted against and those doing the revolting, you're going to get very different narratives. And of course, everyone wants to be the hero of their own narrative, but it's important to get the different perspectives so that you can, see for yourself and see that there's not just one history, but many histories. Speaking of history, a little bit about the historical context beyond your assigned readings that's important to know going into it. That's Christopher Columbus. I'm sure you recognized him immediately by the hat. It's a pretty famous depiction of him, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of information about Christopher Columbus because I'm sure you are familiar with the story. Some tellings of the story are much more favorable than others. We've definitely taken a different kind of approach to Christopher Columbus as a historical figure in the last few decades. But he set sail with a small Spanish fleet in 1492, sort of under the patronage, auspices of the King and Queen of Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand. Contrary to popular belief, he did not think, people did not think the world was flat at that time. That's part of the mythology of it. A lot of people knew that most educated people knew that the world was round and had known since the time of the ancient Greeks. But anyway, what was he doing? Okay, well, he was out to make his fortune, and he was looking for, and I'm going to butcher the Spanish pronunciation, and I apologize to all of our multi-language people in the class. Please forgive me. El Paraíso Terrenal? Basically, an earthly paradise that was described by classical and pre-Renaissance sources. So a lot of cultures have an idea of utopia or Eden or like the perfect world, and this paradise is something that comes up a lot in classical and pre-Renaissance literature, which Columbus himself would have been, and a lot of other people would have been very familiar with. And he thought it really existed, and he was going to try to find it. And he thought it was located in East India. And in fact, until he died, he insisted that what he had found, which we now know was the Caribbean islands, was indeed an East Indian earthly paradise, El Paraíso Terrenal, the entire time. He insisted that. Okay, I mean, way to stick to it, I guess. Okay, so something to really keep in mind too with like Cabeza de Vaca, for instance, in his relation. The Columbus, other explorers, missionaries, they saw everything they encountered in this quote-unquote new world through the lenses and the desires of the familiar. Okay, to quote Ivy Schweitzer, who talks more about this actually in your textbook. If you want to read more, if you're interested in it, there's a chapter called America in the World in America, from pages 107 to 109, and I'm actually going to quote quite heavily from that particular chapter. I'll let you know that through quotation marks, but I figured rather than assigning the reading, I'd just give you some of the highlights. All right, the lenses and desires of the familiar. What did this translate to? Not good. Not good stuff. Look at that painting in the corner. Doesn't that guy look really bored? He's just like kind of over it. He's had a long day and he just doesn't want to hear any more about it. Anyway, this translated to, again to quote Schweitzer, lust for conquest. And that word lust is going to be important. So just hold on. Also a flurry of consumerism and passion for collecting artifacts, commodities, and peoples. Yes, peoples. And a zeal for religious conversion, primarily from the Catholic Church. But also a determination to settle in as many parts and places as possible. So when we think of the Renaissance in Europe, I mean, that means rebirth, and it really was, compared to the Dark Ages, it's considered a really crucial time in human history for science and philosophy and literature and art and looking at things in kind of new, progressive, interesting ways. But that's only kind of true if you're European and you're with other Europeans. When it came to how the Renaissance Europeans saw, especially the leaders, religious leaders and political leaders, saw the native peoples, the keywords are insularity, right, staying separate from them, ethnocentrism, feeling that they were the superior cultural group and that the native peoples were inferior, and being highly intolerant for their cultural practices and religious practices, which again is going to come up in the Pueblo Revolt. It's also a time of extreme binary, meaning just two options, and polarized moral systems. So a very distinct and diametrically opposed idea about good and evil. You're either one or the other. There's no gray area. There's no middle ground. Similarly, a very polarized sense of who is civilized and who is barbaric. This gets kind of, this evolves and changes a bit with, though it's still, it's actually reinforced and even more problematic when we get to what's called the myth of the noble savage. One of your readings of Cannibals addresses this concept. So Montaigne saw, and a lot of people did too, they subscribed to this philosophy of the natives being the noble savage, keyword savage, in that they saw them as a source of naked truth, that they represented like sort of the most base, pure, unadulterated version of human beings that there are on the planet. Like they're almost like primeval in a way, that they're who we once were before we became civilized, but we could find some kind of like a deeper spiritual truth in their savagery and their nakedness. They were seen as like innocent, almost like children, exactly like children, actually. Like they're just a bunch of kids just running around naked, not knowing what to do with themselves, just living the life of Riley. So yeah, as you can imagine, that's a pretty paternalistic view. There's also a really troubling theme of gendering the new, quote-unquote New World as female and as virginal, as something to be ravished, which is a nice polite word for raped, and then subsequently ruled over in a protective, kind of paternalistic way. It's there for the taking. It wants to be taken aggressively. It needs a firm hand, and the colonizers need to come in and take what is rightfully theirs and do something with it. So the New World, again, problematic phrasing, but it's seen as by a lot of people who never went there and never would, as being a utopia. So when you read of Cannibals, Obviously, there were not cannibals. Okay, I just want to make that clear. That passage was written by someone who never visited the New World and never would in his entire life. So this is all based on kind of what he'd heard and thought he knew about the quote-unquote New World, and he saw it as this utopia, as like perfect paradise. Again, that kind of thing that Columbus thought he was looking for. A new Eden, or a new Atlantis. So the myth of Atlantis, y'all are probably familiar with that, but it was this, the idea was that Atlantis was this like perfect civilization, this perfect place that was, subsequently submerged and disappeared forever. And like, oh no, this is the new one. This is the perfect world. And we are here to take control, because they, as you'll see from the readings, really felt that the natives weren't doing anything with the land, and so it was their responsibility to come in and commodify it. So if you were in a face-to-face class, this would be a mini assignment that I would have you do. One of the things I would ask you to do is find an example of a justification given for the conquest of the quote-unquote New World from either the Utopia of Cannibals or New Atlantis passages that you were assigned. So again, you may want to do that. It might show up on a test. You never know. One thing I wanted to show you, and this is something we talk about in class as well, is this painting. This is actually a pretty famous painting from the 1570s, when European artists and map makers had started popularizing a more kind of allegorical image of America as being an indigenous woman. Okay, that would be like the representation of the New World. And this is Jan van der Straat's drawing, who like obviously never set foot in America his entire life, of Amerigo Vespucci, the guy who, the map maker for whom America was named, his quote-unquote discovery of America. This painting circulated widely, and so it had a really huge impact on how people viewed the New World in a kind of symbolic sense. So if you take some time to look at it, there's a lot going on in this piece of art. We've got, what's at the foreground, which is, of course, like all these kind of wild, weird looking animals. Again, the artist would have never been there, so he wouldn't have any idea what kind of animals would be there. So he's probably taking like sort of European animals and just like making them weird looking, because he wouldn't know what else to do, But then we've got this, of course, native woman who looks suspiciously European, because you wouldn't know what a native woman would look like. And she is naked and hanging out, kind of reclining in this hammock, because that's, showing, hey, she's just kicking back. That's what the natives do. They're living the life of Riley. They're living off the fat of the land. They're not industrious like Europeans are. And look at all that hair. It's got kind of a Venus de Milo look to it. And she's sort of getting up and kind of reaching out to our map maker here, who has got some technologies of the time. He's got the flag representing Christianity. He's got the ships in the background, kind of waiting to disembark. And we've got the tools of a navigator, of a shipwright. So he's coming with his technologies, with his Christianity, with legions of other explorers behind him, which gives us a sense of things to come. And then if we look and she's kind of reaching out, welcoming, saying, come hang out in the hammock with me. I mean, that's what I'm seeing anyway. I don't think you probably are too. If we look at the background of the image, what do we see? Well, we see other people. Again, suspiciously pale people, but still. And what are they doing? What do they got on that fire there? Is that a human leg? Well, of course, because they're savages and they're cannibals, right? So a lot to unpack in this painting. But this is really what people thought the quote-unquote New World was like. And that's where we'll take a pause.